Hello, everyone, and good night. Thank you so much for joining us at tonight's webinar, Target Your Audience, The Art of the Abstract. This session is hosted by the iSchool's own student research journal, and the session itself is both designed and delivered by our own content editor, Devon Lee. So I'm going to hand it over to Devon in just a moment, but I did want to start off with just a few brief words about the journal. The student research journal exists to highlight excellent graduate student scholarship in library and information science, archives, and records management. We are also completely student governed and the only double-blind peer-reviewed MLIS journal in North America. We boast 12 issues over 8 years and a team of extremely competent editors. We're getting ready to launch issue 1, volume 7, just next month. And one of the editors responsible for that upcoming issue, as well as tonight's webinar, is Devon Lee. So personally, I'm going to be convocating from the iSchool in just a couple of short weeks, as is Devon, and I'm really delighted that this is going to be my last opportunity to speak at the iSchool. This is a great session to end it off with, and I just want to take this brief opportunity to thank Devon for the amazing work she's done for the journal. This is the second webinar this year that she's created. She's taken the initiative to create and deliver for students at the School of Information, and she's done incredible work to build up the journal as well as the scholarly product that is coming out of the SRJ. So Devon, thank you very much for all of your work on the journal so far. I'm really delighted for tonight's session, and I'm going to let you take it from here.
Thank you, Tamara. Hi everyone, this is Devon. Thanks for tuning in. Tonight I'll be taking you through this workshop on crafting effective abstracts. So we'll take a look at some published abstracts, and then you'll get a chance to try your hand at some practice examples. The tips in this session will help you write abstracts for all kinds of assignments, and I'll also walk you through some of the formatting specifications for manuscripts if you decide to submit to the journal. So by the end, you should have a good understanding of the purpose and the features of a successful abstract. Before we get started, I wanted to open it up for a quick discussion. Go ahead and use the raise hand button if you've had experience using abstracts in your research. Cool, yay, thank you. So for those of you that have, I'm curious what you think makes an abstract useful for you as a researcher. You can go ahead and grab the mic or use the chat box. I know it's hard to think of something on the spot, so if nothing comes to mind, no worries. So Tamarack says, helps to preview the findings. Yes, that's a really good point. An abstract should outline what the paper's purpose is and also some of the key things that the research has uncovered. And Emmanuel says, abstracts help with determining whether I should keep reading the article that I find. That's also a really good point. An abstract should help the reader figure out if the context of the full paper is actually relevant to their research needs before they actually dive into the full thing. So great, thank you for sharing. You hit on some really good points that you'll see pop up again in the presentation. So now we'll go ahead and get started by pinning down the purpose of an abstract. The primary goal of an abstract is to help the reader. So as you have experienced, an abstract helps the reader establish how a piece of writing fits into a larger conversation in the field. As a researcher, reading the abstract is the most effective way to assess the paper's value without reading the entire text. So it's your job as a writer to help your reader figure out if your paper is a good fit for their research needs and their topic. Readers should also be able to get a good idea of your paper's scope and key findings. So Tamarack and Emmanuel, you hit on those two key points. You can also think of the abstract as an elevator pitch because it captures the essence of the full manuscript in a really clear and concise way. So you want to give enough context so that your reader can get the gist of your topic, but not get bogged down in the details. Just like an elevator pitch, the abstract conveys the essential information without relying heavily on supporting documentation. This means saving the direct quotes and diagrams for the full-length paper. And it's also important to avoid referencing specific quotes or figures that appear later in the full manuscript. So the next couple of slides is just a quick overview of the types of abstracts you may have encountered in your research. In its most straightforward form, an abstract can be descriptive. A descriptive abstract is short, typically a paragraph of 100 words or less, in which the author gives a really brief, high-level intro to the subject. It may also include a short description of the paper's purpose, the method, and the scope. Similarly, scientific abstracts outline the purpose of the full-length report. And typically, these types of abstracts include a distinct methodology section. So a scientific abstract may read more like a series of short statements highlighting the methods, the results, and the implications of the research. Now we'll take a look at informative abstracts. This is the style that you'll want to follow when you're writing an abstract for your student research journal submission. And as you can see, an informative abstract includes more information than a descriptive abstract. They're typically longer, about 150 words in a single paragraph, and it defines the paper's context, the purpose, and the significance. So it's a good idea to begin your abstract with some sort of contextual information. Pinpointing the paper's place within the body of scholarship really helps your reader assess your work and its relevance to their needs. So if you imagine you're writing a paper on teaching online search strategies to high school students, you want to preface that discussion in the abstract by describing how your paper fits into the bigger topic, which would be information literacy and also young adult learning. Informative abstracts may also identify the target audience of the manuscript. So you can read some examples here that explicitly identify the paper's intended audience or users. So in the first example, library science students and preservation professionals is the target audience there. And in the second example, the full paper represented in the abstract will be useful for reforming reference desk practices and operations. So if you have any questions on these before we jump into the example, feel free to raise your hand or use the chat box. So this is the first example we'll take a look at. This is a scholarly abstract. The topic of the full paper is international librarianship. You can see that the bulk of the abstract is devoted to providing context to the reader. This helps the reader conceptualize how the paper fits into the larger discussion of library and information science, but on an international scale. You can also see how the outline of the paper is neatly summed up in the highlighted portion of the purpose statement. So as a reader, you can expect the paper to follow this outline and discuss the concepts of international librarianship, its misconceptions, and then move into the application of these concepts. So just to recap, a successful abstract includes contextual information that situates the paper into the larger discussion. So you may hear this larger discussion called anything from existing to previous scholarship, or also the scholarly conversation. And these terms all refer to the body of published papers, books, or presentations on a subject written by professionals in the field. As an author, it's your responsibility to introduce your work into this ongoing conversation. And you can do this in the very beginning of your abstract. You'll also need to help other professionals determine the uses of your research. And you do this by describing your paper's strategic application. And this essentially answers the very important question, so what? What purpose does this paper serve? And as a reader, why should I invest my time to read the whole thing? So say you have written a paper studying the way undergraduate students look for information. You can use your abstract to communicate the value of your work. So for example, the statement, implication statement might be something like, understanding the information-seeking behaviors of undergraduates will lead to improvements in teaching digital literacy. Any questions on this? Great, thanks, Tamara. Okay, moving on to the next example. So these are some questions just to keep in mind when figuring out the context for your work. It's a good idea to write your abstract after the full paper is complete. So this makes it a lot easier to describe your paper's value and answer the so what question. You'll also be able to better describe the specific contributions your paper has made to the field. So far we've covered the things that you should write in your abstract, and this is just a really brief outline to summarize how your abstract could be laid out. And we're going to quickly move on here to look at some common challenges that you may encounter. These are some of the things that we see as student research journal editors. We've defined these as some common errors we've seen in past submissions. Keep in mind that the points here also apply to abstracts for a thesis or dissertation that you plan to write and submit to the iSchool. One of the main challenges authors face is wordiness. Sometimes authors try to cram in everything into their abstract, and this ultimately overwhelms the reader and makes it difficult to judge the paper's value. Alternatively, an abstract can be too brief. This also means the reader can't judge the paper's relevance to their research topic. It is a balancing act, providing just enough information to your reader. So for lengthy abstracts, it's a good idea to go back and trim run-on sentences and edit out repetitive phrases. You can also use the read aloud test. So if you're running out of breath trying to finish a sentence, it probably could use some modifications. A successful abstract submitted to the Student Research Journal includes the core research question and also the thesis. And these can be very simple as long as the essential information is retained. And as we discussed earlier, context is a very important component of an abstract. Vague language is another challenge. Again, it's a balancing act to provide the right amount of detail about your paper. And as you can see in this example at the bottom of the slide, you'll want to avoid passive wording. And the last 2 points here are just reminders to save direct quotes and phrases that need citations for the full paper. And also to avoid just copy and pasting full sentences from your paper into your abstract. As you write your abstract, you may be tempted to withhold your key findings, but stating the key findings makes your abstract statement complete. Omitting the key findings may limit the effectiveness of your abstract. So without this information, you may be deterring busy readers from reading your full report. But also remember that the key findings, you don't need to get into too much detail in the abstract, but do provide a description to really ground your readers' investment into your work. It may seem unfair to give up the most labor-intensive part of your work up front, but it ultimately adds value to your submission as a whole. Other things to keep in mind: avoid using the first person in scholarly literature. So I will examine, or my results show will have to be replaced with something like, this study examines, or results from this review can be used to ... So again, a successful abstract can stand on its own, kind of as a mini paper, and it doesn't make references to sections in the full paper like the discussion or in the conclusion. Okay, so this section is your chance to review some abstracts. We'll take a look at 2 examples and discuss the strengths or weaknesses that you observed. Some questions to keep in mind here are, can you identify the core question and the thesis? Who is it written for? Does it answer the so what question? And do you think this is an effective abstract? Why or why not? And finally, you can put on your editing hat and think up some suggestions for improvement. So the first example we're going to be analyzing introduces the paper called Framing the Library, the Public Perception of the Public Library in the Media. So again, I will post the questions that we'll be thinking about in the chat so you can reference them. And Carolyn, can we set a timer for 5 minutes, please? And then we'll talk about your impressions of this abstract. Okay, so the questions, again, are in the chat. Great, thank you, Carolyn. So when you have some comment to make on the abstract, go ahead and use the chat box or raise your hand. Thanks. Okay, well, I saw some really great comments in the chat. I'll go ahead and go through some of them here. Emmanuel and Tamara hit on the key point here, which is this is a very wordy and repetitive abstract. It's hard to read and also uses some passive voice, which is another thing that we would point out as editors here. Let's see. Victoria mentioned that it describes a lot of the process but not the findings. So yes, an effective abstract does give a little bit more insight into the findings so that we can better understand the implications and the uses for the full paper. Let's see. Yes, Tamarick says, where's my red pen? Exactly. Well, in the next slide, I do mark it up a little bit, so we can take a look at that. Let's see. This is just a summary of some feedback that you might see from a journal editor. Just as Emmanuel and Tamarick mentioned, it's quite wordy, also uses the past tense and passive voice, repetitive sentence structure. There are also some typos in there. Let's see. Some other comments, it does identify the key elements, the purpose, the method, and the implications. And it seems like the abstract could stand on its own as a summary of the process, but as Victoria pointed out, it's not really helpful when it comes to pinning down the actual findings. Some areas that could be improved, as we noted, sentence structure and just the overall length and wordiness. Depending on the intended audience, we may need to ask if the reference to Goffman needs some explanation. So without the background knowledge of communication studies, you might not know that the author is referring to Irving Goffman, who was the founder of this framing theory. And if you had the full paper in front of you, you'd actually see that the author never makes the distinction by mentioning the author's first and last name. It's just Goffman all the way through. So in that case, you really need to think about your audience. Like, would they know who that you're talking about? This might be helpful to understand the feedback more visually. You can see the structure of the abstract highlighted in the orange tags. And in the text itself, you can go through and highlight the areas that need improvement. So you can see the typos and the repetitive use of this study does this, or it examines, it explores, ... Any questions before we move on? Okay, so we'll move on and we'll do the same thing for the second example, I'll post the questions again in the chat. So if everyone's ready, Carolyn, can you set a timer for 5 minutes, please? Perfect, thank you. Great, more great comments in the chat. Let me read some of these aloud. Emmanuel pointed out that LIS is spelled out as Library and Information Science in the very beginning of the abstract, which helps non-experts understand what they're getting into. And also that the language hints that the full paper is a literature review. And this could help the reader think ahead about how the full paper will fit into their research needs. Let's see. Tamarack also made a good point that the abstract doesn't include the methodology. So what does this review actually entail? What does it mean? But it does leave the reader wondering, so it could be effective in that sense. Does anyone have suggestions for improving this abstract? Emmanuel also says, I personally feel intrigued enough to keep on reading through the intro. Yeah, that's a good point. I mean, some abstracts are very brief summaries and you come away with it like, okay, well, that's enough. I don't really need to go into the whole paper. But this one does lead the reader in. Yes, Tamarack, I agree. It does need a method just to give backing to the implications. So yes, it could be effective in that way, that it does encourage the reader to go on and read the full paper. Let's see, I'm going to jump ahead to some other feedback that I came up with. Again, some of my comments here apply to the full, I'm sorry, totally messed up there. My main comment here applies to the final sentence of the abstract, to make it more active and end the abstract on a stronger note. So let's take a look here. Just a more structured view of the example. You can see the main points and the sentence that uses the passive voice, there's only one, and also a suggestion for the final sentence. Okay, any other comments before I jump into some writing tips? Okay. So in this last section, we'll cover some writing tips and also the specifications for any submissions that you make to the journal. So we're in the home stretch here. These writing tips will help you avoid the common errors that we saw in the examples. And we've covered most of these already, but I do want to point out the second tip, writing in the present tense. This is a convention of scholarly abstracts. Even though your paper is complete, you'll be talking about it in the present tense. One of the most common requests that the editorial team makes to authors is to replace the first person pronouns throughout the full manuscript. So statements like, I researched X, or my results are important because ... These would need to read more like, this paper is based on research that included ... or this study's results are important because ... So writing your abstract in the present tense and avoiding the first person in the full paper will ultimately help you avoid making surface fixes to your submission. Again, recapping some of the points we've highlighted, your abstract needs to be concise. Think of it as the elevator pitch, that you do your best to answer the so what question to really grab and hold your reader's attention. Here are the important things that you need to know about submitting a manuscript and an abstract to the Student Research Journal. Your abstract should be between 150 and 200 words in a single paragraph. Keep in mind, there's no distinct methodology paragraph needed, but you will be asked to provide a list of keywords. So you can see the formatting specifications there. They're going to need to be italicized, indented, and there's no periods at the end of the list. Just some things to keep in mind. Once you have your abstract ready to submit, you can ask yourself these questions. First, is your abstract in the word range, which is 150 to 200 words? Does it include your research question and thesis? Also, who's your audience? Who are you wanting this work to be read by? Is it other graduate students or practicing professionals? And once you figure that out, you should consider if your intended audience can understand the full paper based on the abstract alone. So if you're having trouble with this, you can ask a classmate to read your abstract and describe their impression of the topic or implications without having read the full paper. So these are the most important links for anyone interested in submitting work to the journal. Through the journal homepage, you can access this information on acceptance policies and also the journal's aims and scopes. So these pages will give you a good overview of the types of submissions that we work with. And for myself and the Student Research Journal editors, we're learning right along with you and are always looking for advice to improve our editing abilities. So if you have any abstract writing tips or resources that I left out, maybe you took an undergraduate class that was really great on teaching you how to write abstracts, please feel free to share. The email for the journal is at the top of the slide here. Well, that wraps up my part of the workshop. So as you digest all of this information, I'd love to hear what the most important takeaway was for you. And also, since this is the first iteration of this webinar, I'd really appreciate any suggestions that you have for improvement. Maybe the pace was too fast, too slow. Don't be shy. Your feedback is going to really help us create resources that are helpful for you as writers. So feel free to grab the mic or use the chat box. And since we have some editors on the line, if you have any tips, feel free to share those too. Oh, thanks, Victoria. Victoria says the examples are great and a good exercise. I really hope that was helpful for you. Let's see, if there aren't any comments or questions, I will go ahead and wrap up and let you out early. I hope you feel more confident going forth and writing abstracts. Just a reminder, this recording will be shared, and I think we're uploading it to YouTube as well. So there will be links and examples and also another handout with the examples that we used with the feedback on it. And if you think of any other questions about abstracts or submitting to the journal, feel free to reach out. Again, our email is, oh, thanks, Amrak, it's in the chat box. And with that, I'll let you go. Enjoy your evening and wish you good luck on the rest of the semester. Thanks, everyone. Good night.